I'm talking to John Hovell, who is CEO and founder of a company called STRATactical, prior to which he worked for many years in human resources for major projects in the aerospace and defense industries. John, there's been a lot of talk about the demographic time bomb, but I wondered, what does this actually mean and what is the risk that it presents to organizations and their projects and programs?
I've noticed this phrase demographic time bomb. There are many synonyms to that phrase. I've heard retirement wave, I've heard silver tsunami, I've heard the long goodbye, the baby boomer exodus. It's just sort of so many different phrases that I think mean the same thing, but may be slightly different depending on the context and the organization. I would look at it from a cause and effect kind of point of view. So if we take a very simple cause and effect, I think retirements are happening every single day. But in your organization, in your context, is it an increasing pattern? Are there more retirements happening? Are there more impactful retirements happening? Do you expect to see more or less retirements 10 years from today than you do today? Is that maybe what we mean by demographic time bomb? Or is there a more complicated or complex view of this challenge? Complicated would mean a few causes. Maybe that there really were an increased number of births after each of the world wars. Maybe there really was a drop-off of a different number of generational births. I think we call it the M curve. Sometimes I've heard it called the bathtub curve, where there's a certain number of births followed by a much lower number, followed by then a somewhat higher number. If that's happening, then what about attrition, divestiture, rotations, promotions? Is that all part of this as well? That might be the complicated view of demographic time bomb. And then the complex view, multiple causes and multiple effects, generational differences, this language we're now using called the gig economy, where people are just bouncing very quickly, low levels, in theory, of job satisfaction and employee engagement, where people are not quite as connected to their role, and then the perceived speed of change. It seems as though change is happening faster and faster and faster. Is all of that this demographic time bomb? Maybe, maybe not. What risk does that provide? Well, I've, in my personal career, heard sort of the for and the against. On the for side, people are seeing this as perilous. They're seeing it as it's so frustrating, I want to do something about it, and yet others aren't buying in. So there's this almost force field of for and against, whether it's even happening or not. There is something about, in reality, Joe Bloggs is retiring next week. And I am fearful of when Joe leaves or Jane leaves or Jill or this person that someone brings to mind, I'm fearful. I'm not sure what it looks like after that. That's the, yes, there is a demographic time bomb. Something is happening. We should do something about it. And then I've very clearly heard the against side. This is not happening. Retirements have always happened. This is nothing new. Or, even more extreme, we've heard this demographic time bomb coming for a decade now, and it's never come. I don't think it's going to come. We should stop talking about it. That's also been a very real perspective that I've heard. So then your real question of what's the risk or what does it mean? To me, tacit knowledge, the stuff that we know deep down inside ourselves, almost subconscious type knowledge, it's not only in individuals, but it's also in the network. So there's risk of losing individuals and there's risk of losing subject matter networks. The tacit knowledge that exists within a group of people, let alone employee and customer satisfaction challenges, quality, delivery, best possible decisions and actions, not only based on the individual, but the network itself. I believe all of that relates to the challenge of this demographic time bomb.
How did you respond to this in your career up to now? So, in the aerospace and defense industries?
I would start by saying top-down and bottom-up approaches. So from a bottoms-up approach, we found teams. We found passionate people who were willing to either at cost spend time and resource, or out of their own volition, their own interest, their own passion, be willing to work on this frankly quite complex challenge of so many moving parts, not sure how to approach it, and every individual and every group and every team and every organization has a slightly different view. So teams of people approaching it, collaborating on it, but then also getting senior leadership buy-in, getting executive buy-in. There are charts out there that you can either grab from the public domain or inside your own organization, work with human resources or project managers, whoever has demographic data, to then show you what your demographic chart looks like. Often getting that chart and then crafting a presentation, or frankly just showing that one data point to say, here's what our age curve looks like, or here's what the wave of retirements might look like. We've even calculated the area underneath that curve to then say it looks like X percentage of people are likely to retire in the next few years. And then we've even done it so you can redraw that curve on a year-over-year overlay. So you can watch the sort of the large area underneath the curve get closer and closer to current day. That's been one other effective way. We also, in all of the large organizations, all the organizations that I've worked for, been fortunate to work with, we've gone out and we've looked and we've done a knowledge management practice of after-action reviews and lessons learned, home and away or peer assists, where we've worked and partnered with other groups to study their knowledge transfer and knowledge sharing, knowledge retention approaches. One of the partnerships I remember the most is working with Kate Pugh, who ran the knowledge management master's program at Columbia University in the States. We found 13 different knowledge transfer or knowledge retention approaches. We compared all 13 of them to then come out with, depending on what your context and your situation is, an application or an adaptation of those models into what would fit inside not only your large organization, but also your program or your project or your team, or frankly, even within your individual self. So many different approaches. We found an interesting overlap between these 13 different approaches. Some of these approaches focused on the individual, on the person, on that person's individual tacit knowledge. Some of these approaches focused on the role. So one was a person approach, one was a role approach, the vice president of engineering, the executive vice president of human resources. It was a role knowledge transfer approach. Some of these approaches focused on the task or the project or the actions. We can't lose the ability to do this capability, which didn't matter who the role or the person was. That ended up being one of our core questions early on for any knowledge transfer, any knowledge retention, any knowledge sharing approaches. Are we most interested on the person, the role, or the task, or some combination of the three? That seemed to be quite an impactful question.
That's fascinating. And this process of transferring what is effectively someone's experience, their tacit knowledge, is by no means easy. So what kind of results did you get from what you were doing?
Some positive, some less than positive. You certainly have that phrase knowledge hoarding that exists, where certain individuals have a personality, have a mindset of it's not worth my time, or I'm not interested to share, or whatever challenge presents itself for sharing. I thought maybe I'll share a story or two about success or results we've had. Without naming names or specific organizations, one story that comes to mind is from one of our senior engineering fellows. So this individual had been in the business for just over 3 decades. So sometime in one organization, one part of a large business. He had worked up through the ranks in a very technical field. He was loved and adored by hundreds, if not thousands, but at least hundreds of people that sort of reported within his sphere of influence directly. When he announced his retirement, there wasn't sort of this, often you'd find an excitement of, oh, that person's retiring. There's an excitement of, oh, I will go for that role. I will apply for that role. This was different. When this person announced his retirement, there was sadness that came with it. People were, it felt like a real loss. There was almost a grieving that happened around, we can't lose this person. This is a big loss for us, not as opposed to the excitement of, oh, I think I'd like to go for that role now. What a great opportunity. There was a sadness that was felt. We offered, as the human resources arm of knowledge transfer and knowledge retention, we offered a knowledge retention team to get together and work through what this person had done for the business to make sure that the organizational memory was maintained even after he was gone. Formed the team. The team met about 2 hours a week for about 6 months. They put together a plan. They had a list of questions. They worked through with some expert facilitation this very difficult list of questions. It was learner-led learning was the approach to what is it that I already know, what does the team already know, what is it that we don't know, and then the final step of this approach was to practice and innovate. Are there new ways of doing this gentleman's role now that he's still here and that he's about to leave? What came out of that was a physically published and printed book that to this day people love and adore and flip back to the book. There's also the customer perspective of the major programs and projects that he was on and helping to lead and all of his team members. We went directly to the customer and said, what was the impact of him leaving? And the actual response was, we miss him too, but actually it wasn't as big an impact as we expected. In fact, very little impact, if you don't mind us saying. So in a way, it was positive and a negative mixed together. That's one story, a successful example. I'll also share a less than successful example. So that was quite a senior technical person. We also had a senior executive person who was leading a major business, not as interested to share. It was more of just a quick retirement, move on. This particular person decided not to do a knowledge transfer team, although took on many efforts of knowledge transfer. I might try an exit interview. I might try a PowerPoint. I might try some documentation. I'll offer my knowledge. What happened in reality in that approach was the role was not backfilled. They ended up disbanding that business, dividing it, and removing it into other different approaches to run those functions, those programs. So you sort of can't even ask the question of, well, how did it play out? Because it changed so much fundamentally as an organization design approach that it doesn't exist anymore as a question to be asked. Is that a success or a failure? I'm not sure, but it certainly is a much different approach than the love and the awe-inspiring carrying on of organizational memory through a proper knowledge retention approach.
My experience has been very similar when key players have left the business. There's a sense of foreboding, but actually you realize that you can continue to work once they've left. I think that's very much the positive side of people leaving the business. A few businesses depend solely on one person. But I think the other thing which you're maybe alluding to, which I find really interesting, is that tacit knowledge is clearly a dynamic resource. So trying to somehow capture somebody's tacit knowledge, you need to ask yourself how much of what this person knows is still relevant, even while they are still doing the job, and how much of it will continue to be relevant. I wonder, you talked about roles and capabilities and indeed personalities or individuals. I wonder what impact you think all this is having on how organizations should recruit and manage their project teams.
So many related disciplines come together here. So project management, knowledge management, organization development, diversity and inclusion, creative thinking, even fields like systems thinking, game theory, org design. Multiple fields are coming together and sort of merging and yet staying apart at the same time. I'd like to think there's a growing value and a growing understanding of the value of experience and know-how and tacit knowledge, but frankly, I'm not sure there is a growing understanding. Certain individuals and networks and teams are seeing more and more value and more creative approaches to getting knowledge flowing within an organization, optimal decisions, or at least making the same decision faster than competitors or than others. I also think of a chart for me. When you think of this, how do I recruit, how do I manage? I think of a chart that shows the Fortune 500 and the average age of companies in that Fortune 500. If you look at 1960, I've got the chart right up in front of me, 1960, the average age of the Fortune 500 company was 60 years old. Whereas 20 years later in 1980, the average Fortune 500 company was 35 years old. Whereas today, the average age of the Fortune 500 is 15 years old. So we've gone from 60 to 35 to 15 years old. So companies from a financial point of view are getting larger faster at a younger age. Now factor in that gig economy we talked about earlier where people are moving more quickly. There's something around managing this risk. It's moving faster, and yet we're trying to take on even larger, more complex approaches. The question about how do I recruit and how do I manage that, I think of Dr. Michael Zak at Northeastern University, who did research to say, if the language of for-profit business is finance, does knowledge management directly increase financial performance of an organization? That was the hypothesis he went in with. The long and the short of his research and his story is, yes, there is a direct impact between KM and financial performance, but almost more interestingly, there's a hop in between. He proved, I don't want to say beyond the shadow of a doubt, but with proper statistics, that knowledge management increases operational performance. Operational performance increases financial performance. Making that tie was the aha that came out of his research to show when you do proper, professional, experienced KM, you can increase the operations of a business, which will increase the financial performance. I've only spent a few years or so in that recruiting area of the business. So I don't know that I can directly say, how do we recruit differently? I can say there is something about the social, the collective approach to recruiting that is fundamentally different. What you might be looking for is hiring for passion as opposed to skill and talent. You can train for skill and talent. You're looking for the real passion, the real interest, the real sort of learning setup of a person. I also find that conversational leadership is popping up as a new phrase. Potentially this is what's between these other fields that are coming together. Maybe it's a new look, or maybe it's just a dispersed view that's come together in this phrase of conversational leadership, that if you're looking for that in your management of projects and your recruiting of people, potentially adds tremendous value. And maybe one last comment I'll talk about is a specific example of how do you recruit and manage your projects. Stakeholder management comes up for me as a project management perspective of this question. Maybe there's a way to look at core team, extended team, and full stakeholder, and actually address and communicate. We talk about in project management, communicate, communicate, communicate. Maybe there are approaches from a flow of knowledge, operational excellence, financial performance where your core team is communicating a certain way, your extended team is communicated and included in a certain way, and your full stakeholder audience has its own way of communicating. And then between those boundaries, finding a way so that inclusion is high, decision-making is high, productivity, quality, safety is all doing the best it can because of a flow of tacit knowledge across those stakeholders.